Somewhere in your past there is a stretch of hours that your own memory refuses to hand back to you. It belongs to the day a mask came down over your face, or a cold line went into the back of your hand, and a voice asked you to count. You got partway through, and the next thing that exists for you is a different ceiling, a different room, and a nurse saying your name. Between the counting and the ceiling there is nothing at all, and it is a particular kind of nothing. A nap leaves a fragment behind it, a turning over, a half-memory of the curtain moving. A deep night's sleep leaves at least the dark and the sense that hours went by inside it. This stretch leaves neither, and most people say something similar when they come back from it. A feeling that some small piece of them went somewhere during those hours, and a quiet uncertainty about whether all of it came home. That feeling is real. It is pointing at an event that took place inside your skull. That event is stranger and more exact than a piece of you going missing. Consciousness, as far as any instrument has ever managed to measure it, is the whole brain talking to itself across distance. Regions at the front and the rear and the deep center exchange signals quickly enough that a sound, a sight, a touch, and a thought fuse into the one seamless moment you happen to be living. The common picture of going under is a light going out. What the instruments record is something else entirely. Every region keeps working. What the anesthetic takes away is the long-distance conversation between them, and for as long as it is gone, the machinery that stitches each moment to the next is uncoupled. For that stretch there was no thread being written. So what does it mean for consciousness to be a conversation, and what was uncoupled? Now, your brain is roughly the size of two fists pressed together, and a signal leaving the rear of it, where vision is first handled, has about 15 centimeters to travel before it reaches the front, where planning and judgment live. The cables that carry it that far are the insulated ones, wrapped in a fatty sheath that lets a pulse move at tens of meters a second, while the short bare fibers inside any single region pass their signals along at a crawl by comparison. Along the fast cables, a pulse crosses the whole brain in a few tens of milliseconds. Speed matters here because a moment of experience, the kind you can say you had, needs those distant regions trading pulses back and forth inside a window of roughly a tenth of a second. Inside that window, what the eyes delivered and what the ears delivered and what you were thinking about arrive as one thing. Below that rate of exchange, the parts of the brain go on processing, and their results never meet. You can catch the window at work without any equipment at all. When a person across a table speaks, the sound reaches your ears and the movement of their lips reaches your eyes by completely separate routes, handled in regions several centimeters apart, and what you experience is a single event. A voice coming out of a mouth. The binding runs so fast and so completely that the separate deliveries are invisible to you. That invisible binding is the thing at stake, and it leaves a measurable signature. Picture a full orchestra on a stage, every player working through their part, note for note, just as written. Then a set of screens rolls out between the strings and the brass and the woodwinds, so that no group can see or hear any other. The sound continues. It fills the hall. The music, which only ever existed in the agreement between the parts, has stopped. That is the state the anesthetic produces. A stage full of sound with the music gone out of it. By far the cleanest demonstration of the screens going up came from a group in Milan and Wisconsin who fired a brief magnetic pulse at a small patch of the scalp and watched, with electrodes, where the echo of that pulse went. In an awake person, the echo spreads across the whole surface of the brain, bouncing from region to region for a third of a second in a complicated changing pattern. In that same person, under propofol, or under a sedative, or under the anesthetic gas xenon, the echo stays put. It rises and falls in the patch that was hit and travels nowhere, a simple ripple that dies where it started. Your own head, on the afternoon in question, was handling signals the same way for hours. Casali and Massimini traced that collapse in the journal Science Translational Medicine, and the detail that matters most is the patch itself. It answered the pulse strongly every time. The tissue was awake. The connections were closed, which raises the question of what physically closes them. Several families of anesthetic drug, acting on different targets, all produce the one effect. That was the argument Alcar, Hudetz, and Tononi set out in the journal Science. Whatever the chemistry, consciousness leaves when the brain's capacity to integrate information across distance falls below a threshold, and long-range traffic is the casualty the drugs share. The commonest of them is the milky white liquid in the syringe. Propofol works on the brain's brakes. Every neuron carries a brake pedal, a channel that lets in a negatively charged ion when the brain's main inhibitory messenger lands on it, and propofol holds that pedal down for longer each time it is pressed. Braking grows heavier across the whole brain at once. The loops that carry the long-distance conversation, the ones running between the outer layer of the brain and the relay hub at its center, are the first to slow below the rate at which a shared moment can be assembled. Experience stops being put together. How much of your brain is still running while all of that is going on can be measured in energy, and the number surprises people. Your brain is about 1/40th of your body by weight, and takes roughly a fifth of the energy your body spends at rest, most of it going to the constant electrical work of nerve cells. Under a full anesthetic, that consumption falls by something between a third and a half, and there it stops. It does not approach zero. Cells go on burning sugar and oxygen at a rate no other organ of that size comes close to, keeping their voltages and their machinery in order, all afternoon in a person who is not there. You have felt the arrival of that breaking if you have been under. The drug goes into a vein in the arm and needs one full trip around the circulation to reach the head, which takes something close to 30 seconds. Then a warmth spreads up the arm. Sounds in the room go thin and far away. The ceiling seems to lean, and the last number you speak comes out slower than the one before it. Each of those is a region losing its place in the conversation. Hearing is usually among the last to go. That hub deserves a name because it sits at the center of everything that follows. Every sense you own, apart from smell, passes through a pair of structures the size of walnuts deep in the middle of the brain before it reaches the surface, and the surface answers back to them on every cycle. That pair is the thalamus. The conversation that builds a moment runs between the thalamus and the outer layer, up and down, dozens of times a second, and propofol lands hardest on exactly that loop. Smell, the one sense that skips the hub and reaches the surface of the brain by its own private road, goes down with all the rest, and that tells you something about where the failure sits. A route left open delivers nothing useful when there is nothing at the far end to bind what arrives. Every road in stayed open. What went quiet was the traffic across the middle. If no shared moment was being assembled for those hours, a second question is hiding inside the gap. What is there to remember from a stretch of time when nothing was ever bound together? And then, the order in which things fail is where the answer starts. Anesthetists have known for decades that a smaller amount of propofol is enough to stop you laying down memories than is needed to stop you being conscious. Patients given a light dose can hold a conversation, answer questions, squeeze a hand on command, and keep none of it afterward. The recording machinery goes first. This is why the counting itself so often goes missing. Many people remember starting and nothing past the first few numbers, though they almost certainly reached 7 or 8 before the lights went down. Those last minutes before the gap were lived. They were simply never filed. Where does the filing happen, and why does it fail so early? New memories are first written in a curled structure about the size of your little finger, one on each side of the brain tucked into the inner surface of the temple. That structure is the hippocampus, and what it does is physical. To fix a moment in place, it strengthens the connections between particular cells, and a connection only strengthens when the cell sending a signal and the cell receiving it fire within a few tens of milliseconds of each other, in the right order, again and again. Timing is the whole mechanism. Propofol, by holding every brake pedal down longer, stretches the silences between firings and knocks that timing out of its window, and the hippocampus is among the most sensitive places in the brain to that stretching. Writing fails before reading does. Then the experience itself stops being built, and the two failures stack. To lay down a memory of a moment, your brain has to do two things in order. It has to assemble the moment, the bound, integrated experience, and then encode it, writing the pattern of strengthened connections that can be read back later. Encoding depends on the same long-range coordination as the assembly. Under a full anesthetic, both are gone at once. No integrated experience is being formed, and no encoding machinery is running to capture one if there were. The interval becomes a stretch of time for which no memory could be written because nothing was ever assembled to write. That is the best current account. It is the reading the connectivity evidence predicts rather than a settled single result, though every measurement so far sits on its side. Well, the clearest view of what a brain does instead came from electrodes on the scalp of volunteers in Boston. A conscious brain with the eyes closed carries a slow, rolling wave across the rear of the head, about 10 cycles a second. That is the alpha rhythm. At the moment consciousness left, that wave abandoned its usual home and settled at the front, strong and steady, and a far slower wave appeared underneath it, one cycle every second or so, rolling across the whole brain. Purdon and Brown recorded the migration in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What makes it more than a curiosity is what the slow wave does to time. Under it, cells in any one region are free to fire only during a brief window of each cycle, a fraction of a second, and then they fall silent until the next one. The windows in different regions fall out of step with each other. This was the state of your own head while the surgeon worked. The front of the brain is open while the rear is shut, and by the time the rear opens, the front has closed. Every region is working. They are never working together. No shared clock is left in which a moment could be held. All of that is precise enough to steer by, which is the part few patients know. An anesthetist can watch the front of head rhythm on a monitor through the whole operation and read the depth of the uncoupling off the screen, adjusting the drug to hold a person exactly where the long-range conversation stays down and no deeper. The monitor is reading the absence of your experience live as a shape on a graph. Those shapes also change with age in a way the machine has to allow for. The frontal rhythm that marks a young brain going under arrives weaker and more ragged in an older one, which is one reason the dose that suits a person at 30 is a different dose at 70, and why the anesthetist watches the trace rather than the body weight. Ordinary sleep leaves fragments because a sleeping brain never goes this far. It stays partly integrated, cycles through stages, dreams, surfaces, shifts position and half registers the room. Those fragments are why a night feels like time passing even when you cannot account for most of it. Under the anesthetic, the partial integration that would produce a fragment is gone, and so the edge of the interval comes out clean, a cut rather than a blur. An edge with nothing behind it. That is the fact of it. The feeling that arrives when you wake, that something is missing and cannot be found, is what your brain does when it meets that fact, and it turns out to be the most accurate thing about the whole experience. You now know why the interval is empty and why there was never a memory to recover from inside it. The question changes here, from what the drug did to you to what your own brain does when it reaches back and finds the place where those hours should have been. Well, your brain runs on continuity. It expects one moment to lead to the next, and it checks the thread constantly, without asking you, the way an ear keeps track of a clock ticking in the next room, and only reports when the ticking stops. That checking is how you know, on waking any ordinary morning, that a night has passed rather than a minute. It is a sense of elapsed time built out of the faint record of what happened in between, and it works so reliably that you never notice it working. When you come out of the anesthetic, that machinery reaches back for the continuous record that should join the moment before the drug to the moment in the recovery room. It finds an edge with nothing on the other side. A blur would have been smoothed over. A seam cannot be. Your brain can locate exactly where the missing stretch belongs, the last few seconds of counting on one side and the ceiling on the other, and it cannot fill the space between, because nothing was ever written there. That mismatch, a located gap with no content, is the feeling. What you experience as absence is your continuity-checking machinery working correctly and reporting accurately that here is an interval it cannot account for. So the instinct that a piece of you went somewhere has the location right and the cause wrong. A stretch of your own afternoon holds no content, and a brain built to notice that is noticing it. The feeling is detection. What the detection is built from explains why the feeling is so hard to shake. Your sense of being one continuous person is assembled fresh, many times a second, out of two ingredients. One is the moment being lived. The other is the thread of moments behind it. The hours under the drug contribute nothing to the thread. So the first moment after waking is joined directly to the last moment of counting, with the join showing. People described coming round as though no time had passed, and also as though a great deal had. And both descriptions are right. The thread says no time passed. The clock on the wall and the dressing on the wounds say hours did. Your brain holds both readings at once, and the unease is the distance between them. There is a measurable version of that same disagreement. Ask people surfacing from an operation how long they were under, and their guesses scatter wildly, and they scatter in a particular direction, because a stretch with no events in it gives the estimating machinery nothing to weigh. Duration, to your brain, is built out of change. A morning packed with events reads as long in memory and short while you live it. An empty interval has no events at all, which is why the internal answer to how long you were gone comes back with no number in it at all. If the gap is a seam with nothing on the far side, what is waking, and why does it arrive the way it does? Waking from an anesthetic is the conversation resuming. As the drug leaves the brain, the heavy braking lifts, the slow wave breaks up, the front of head rhythm loosens and drifts back toward the rear where it belongs, and the loops that run down to the thalamus and back pick up speed. Regions begin answering each other again. The streams refuse. A unified moment assembles, this time in the recovery room, and your continuity picks up from there. Coming out is no mirror of going in, which is one of the stranger findings in the Boston recordings. Signatures of a brain coming back arrived in a different order from the signatures of it going under. A brain also stays unconscious at drug concentrations lower than the one that put it out, as though the uncoupled state carried a weight of its own that takes extra effort to lift. Anyone who has watched a relative surface from an operation has seen the result. Those slow, sticky, half-there minutes in which a person answers a question and then, a moment later, asks it themselves. Hearing tends to return before the sense of being the one who hears, which is why so many people recall a voice saying their name before they recall anything else at all. Sleep and anesthesia part company completely on this point, and the difference is one you can hear in any recovery room. A sleeping brain can be reached from outside. Say the name of a sleeping person loudly enough and the signal forces its way through, because sleep raises a barrier that a strong enough input can still cross. Nothing crosses into an uncoupled brain. The surgeon can open an abdomen and the sound and the sensation arrive at the surface of the brain as they always would, and no amount of input assembles them into anything, because the assembly itself is what has been suspended. Volume solves the problem of a raised barrier. It does nothing to a conversation that has stopped. There is also reason you get no sense of the gap closing, no experience of time restarting. You cannot experience the moment integration returns until it has already returned. Consciousness comes back from the inside, with no vantage point from which to watch it happen. One moment there is no thread, the next there is, and the next is the only one you can occupy. So much for the gap, and for the waking. The question that sends most people looking in the first place is still standing, and it deserves the full answer. Does what was lost come back, and how long does that take? Answering it begins with the interval itself, and that part is short. Those hours hold no content and never will, because none was recorded. Nothing sits there to be recovered, and in the sense of damage, nothing is missing, and the machine that does the recording runs on a real timeline. In seconds to minutes, consciousness itself returns as the connections recouple. You are awake, aware, integrated again, and usually groggy, because the drug settled into fat and muscle during the operation and keeps leaking back into your blood for hours afterward. A low tide of breaking that takes its time to drain. In the hours and days that follow, many people, and more often older people, feel a fog, slowed thinking, a word that will not come, the sense of running a step behind your own mind. This is common, and it is real, and it has been counted. In the first large international study to measure it properly, more than 1,000 patients past 60 were tested before and after major surgery, and a substantial minority showed measurable cognitive change a week later. Mahler and colleagues published that count in The Lancet, and it is the figure sitting behind the fog. Across the following weeks, the curve falls steeply. By 3 months after surgery, the share of those patients still showing measurable change had shrunk to a small minority, and most of the people affected at the first test had recovered their sharpness. For most people, the fog lifts. Of course, the limit sits at the far end of that curve, and it deserves stating plainly. In a small fraction, particularly older patients after major or lengthy operations, some cognitive change persists longer, into a year and occasionally past it. Follow-up of that same group put the figure well under 1 in 100 a year or two out. The number is small, a minority of a minority, and it is real. Why older patients, and why longer operations? The answer points away from the syringe. An operation is a controlled injury, and injured tissue releases signaling molecules into the blood that tell the whole body a wound exists. Those molecules reach your brain, and the brain's own housekeeping cells answer them by shifting into a defensive, inflamed state that slows the very loops the drug had slowed a few hours earlier, this time from the inside and for days rather than hours. An older brain carries less spare capacity to absorb that slowing, and a longer operation sends more of the signal. The fog tracks the size of the wound and the reserve of the person far more closely than it tracks the drug. One finding rarely reaches the patient, and it settles the question of blame. The cleanest possible test is to remove consciousness in one group and leave it intact in another, then compare minds afterward. In a trial of 1,600 older adults with broken hips, half were given a full general anesthetic and the rest a spinal injection that numbed the body and left them awake. The rate of confusion and cognitive trouble in the days afterward came out alike in both groups. Newman and colleagues randomized those patients and reported the result in the New England Journal of Medicine. Keeping the long-distance conversation running protected nothing, which is the strongest evidence available that the uncoupling and the fog are separate events that happen to share an afternoon. And the feeling itself, the one that sent you looking, that has its own timetable, and it runs on the same continuity machinery. In the first days, the seam is live, checked and rechecked, because your continuity system keeps arriving at it fresh. Then something changes. The seam gets filed. The gap becomes a thing you remember having rather than a thing your brain is detecting. Once it has been written into the record as an event with a date and a hospital attached, the checking stops returning an error. Most people describe the eeriness fading across a few weeks into a fact they can state calmly. Now, anyone carrying a worry about their own thinking after a procedure has a conversation worth having with their anesthetist or surgeon. They can weigh the individual factors, age, the length and type of operation, the state of the heart and the blood vessels, that no general figure can. These numbers describe a population. They are a portrait of many people and a prediction about none of them. The gap then, once more, the stretch with nothing in it. What sits there is a length of your own timeline with no content. For that stretch, the long-distance conversation inside your head was uncoupled. Every region of your brain kept working alone, and nothing was ever bound together into a moment that could be lived or remembered. When the drug cleared, the regions found each other again. You picked up your thread on the far side of the seam. The feeling that something is missing is your brain doing exactly what it is built to do, checking that one moment leads to the next, and reporting honestly that here, once, it did not. The missing something was time without an interior. You met the one stretch of your life that was never written down. And you felt, correctly, the shape of the space where it would have been.